In January of 1878, a wheelwright took off his gloves at 36 below zero and repaired a wagon beside a wall everyone had mocked for months. That was the impossible part. The wall was not warm. It was stone. It was exposed to the same knife-edged mountain air as everything else in the Colorado high country. But the man's fingers kept moving. Across the road, iron tools were freezing to leather gloves. Wagon grease had turned into a yellow brick. Water pails were splitting open in cabins with red-hot stoves. Yet beside Luca Marri's strange foundation, a grown man worked bare-handed for nearly 20 minutes. The settlement had spent the whole summer laughing at that foundation. Luca's cabin was only a small box of pine logs. Nothing about the house deserved a second look. But beneath it stood a 5-foot platform of dark gray fieldstone, dry stacked so thick and square that the cabin looked as if it had been dropped on top of an old fort. The wall was almost 3 feet wide. It rose above the snow like a low stone tower. Its south face was left fully exposed to the sun. Caleb Rusk, the supply agent in the camp, had stopped his wagon there in August and stared at it with open contempt. "Marri," he said, tapping the stone with the handle of his whip. "A man builds a cabin to live in. You are building a tomb for a house." Luca did not stop setting the capstone. He only pressed his palm against the rock, feeling for the smallest wobble. Then he said, "The cold is not coming through the door, Mr. Rusk." Rusk laughed. "Then where is it coming from?" Luca looked down at the ground. "From there." By sundown, the name had already spread through the camp. Marri's tomb. To the miners, teamsters, and merchants of South Park, it was waste made visible. In a place where men built fast because winter always arrived before a man was ready, Luca had spent 6 weeks hauling stone before he laid the first log. Everyone knew stone was cold. Everyone knew the answer to winter was more wood, tighter chinking, thicker blankets, and a stove that burned like a forge. But Luca was not building against the air. He was building against the frozen earth. And what he knew, he had learned far from Colorado, in the wet dark of the Italian Alps, where stone was not scenery. It was a living force. Luca Marri had been born in a valley north of Lake Como, in a village where the mountains pressed so close that sunlight arrived late and left early. His father and grandfather had both worked stone. Not decorative stone, not church stone, working stone. They lined drainage galleries. They repaired retaining walls after avalanches. They built the heavy dry walls that held roads against the mountain and kept spring water from tearing farms into ravines. As a boy, Luca learned that stone had behavior. Granite could sweat. Limestone could crumble if it drank too much water. Slate could split clean as a blade. A wall could fail not because the stones were weak, but because a mason had misunderstood where water wanted to go. By 16, he was working in railway tunnels, where the air carried the smell of wet rock, lamp smoke, and men's wool coats. In those tunnels, warmth and cold did not behave like they did in houses. The deeper galleries were not warm in the way a stove was warm. They were steady. Even in winter, a properly lined passage had a calm temperature, because the stone around it did not change its mind every hour. The old masons taught him something simple. A heavy wall does not create warmth. It remembers whatever it is connected to. Connect it to frozen ground, and it becomes a thief. Connect it to sunlight, fire, or deep earth, and it becomes a reservoir. Luca did not know the word thermal mass. He had never seen an engineering textbook. He could not calculate heat capacity or R values. But he knew the feeling of a stone face that had held the day's warmth after sunset. He knew how a tunnel wall could make the air feel less raw. He knew that the wrong foundation could drain heat from a room faster than a cracked window. He brought that knowledge to Colorado in 1876 with his wife, Elena, and their small son, Nico. The promise was silver. The papers back east called the mountains a place where a man could start over. Luca imagined stonework in open air, wages paid in coin, and a house built for his own family instead of another man's railroad. They arrived too late. Their first cabin went up like every other cabin in the district. Pine logs, mud chinking, roof shakes, floor planks nailed over sills that sat on flat stones directly on the ground. It looked respectable. It nearly killed them. That winter, the floor became colder than the walls, colder than the window glass, colder than the air near the stove. The ground under the cabin froze hard, then heaved. One morning, Luca woke to a crack like a rifle shot as a sill twisted and tore a seam open between two logs. The wind came through that seam so thin and sharp, it felt deliberate. They fed the stove until its sides glowed dull red. Still, Nico woke crying because his blanket was stiff with frost where his breath had touched it. Elena kept a kettle near the fire, but the water pail 3 steps away formed ice by afternoon. On the worst nights, smoke pushed back down the chimney. The air pressure outside became so violent that the stove coughed soot into the room, and Luca had to open the door to clear it. Open the door to the very cold he was trying to survive. For the first time in his life, his hands were useless. He could repair stone. he could read a slope. He could shape a wall that held against spring melt. But inside that cabin, he could not keep his child's feet warm. That was when he understood the real failure. The cabin was not losing a battle with winter air. It was losing a battle with contact. A frontier cabin sitting on frozen ground was not a shelter. It was a warm box clamped to an enormous block of ice. The men in camp treated their homes as if they were closed rooms. They stuffed rags into cracks. They banked snow against the walls. They burned more wood. But the earth beneath them kept swallowing the heat. Conduction was the invisible enemy. Every board touching the frozen ground became a pathway. Every heated plank gave its warmth to the soil below. And the soil below did not warm up like a room. It was too large. It was the mountain itself. The settlers were trying to heat a cabin. Luca realized they were also trying to heat Colorado. By spring, he had made a decision that made no sense to anyone else. He would not build tighter first. He would build higher. When the thaw softened the topsoil, Luca did not cut logs. He dug. He staked a rectangle wider than the cabin he meant to build, then opened a continuous trench around it, nearly 3 feet wide and deep enough to pass below the worst frost. The first week, men stopped to ask if he was building a storehouse. The second week, they asked if he had lost his mind. Then the stones began to arrive. He hauled them from the slope above the creek, dark basalt, pale granite, rust-stained fieldstone, any rock dense enough to punish the mule and useful enough to keep. He sorted them into piles by size and face, the way another man might sort nails or cartridges. He was not hunting beauty. He was hunting mass. The largest stones went into the bottom of the trench, flat faces down, broad faces crossing the corners. Above them he built 2 walls, an inner and an outer skin, and packed the center with smaller stone. No mortar, no lime, no shortcuts. Each rock had to carry. Each rock had to lock. Each rock had to make the next rock easier to trust. The wall rose inch by inch until it stood 5 feet above the ground, thick enough for a man to sit on, high enough to lift the cabin floor out of the death zone of the soil. Caleb Rusk returned while Luca was laying the western face. He stood there, watching the Italian mason choose a stone, turn it twice, reject it, then choose another. "You know the bank values roof and walls," Rusk said, "not buried rock." Luca wiped dust from his cheek. "It is not buried. It might as well be. Nobody sleeps in a foundation. Luca set the stone into place. No, he said, but everyone sleeps on one. By September, the plinth was finished. The top course was a table of flat capstones, level enough that Luca checked it not with a spirit level, but with his open hand. He slid his palm over every seam, feeling for raised edges that would trouble the joists. When he found a ridge, he took a chisel from his belt and knocked it down with 2 quiet taps. Only then did the cabin go up. 2 hired men helped him raise the pine walls. Compared with the foundation, the house looked almost temporary. A plain wooden body perched on a black stone boot. The floor joists rested on the stone. Under the cabin, air moved freely. Snow could drift around the base. Wind could pass beneath the floor. This bothered everyone. The other settlers spent autumn sealing the bottoms of their cabins with mud, brush, boards, and packed snow. Luca did the opposite. He kept the base clear. "The wind under your house will steal your heat," a miner told him. Luca shook his head. "The ground steals more." That was the part no one could see. The plinth had 2 jobs. The first was to break the direct path between the floor and the frozen earth. The cabin no longer sat on the ice block of winter ground. It sat on a separate mass. The second job was stranger. Every clear day, even in deep cold, the low winter sun struck the south face of the stone. Dark rock absorbed that light slowly. It did not become hot. It did not need to. Hour after hour, the warmth moved inward through the wall, stored in the heavy mass where the night wind could not take it all at once. By evening, the stone held a gentle surplus. When the air temperature collapsed after sunset, the plinth released that stored warmth slowly. Some of it radiated outward and was lost, but some moved inward and upward into the sheltered space beneath the cabin floor. The floor did not become warm. That was not the miracle. The miracle was that it stopped being cold. In a mountain winter, the absence of cold can feel like mercy. The test came in January. A blue norther dropped over the mosquito range and settled into the basin like a lid. For 9 days, the sun rose into a sky so clear it looked cruel. At noon, the temperature stayed below 0. At night, it fell to 30 below, then lower. The camp shrank to stove circles and wood piles. In Rusk's store, men stood shoulder to shoulder around the iron heater while a crate of vinegar froze under the counter. Nails stuck to damp gloves. Bread had to be cut with a hatchet. Outside, axes rang all day because every family needed more fuel than they had planned. The Hollis cabin down the road burned a cord of wood in less than a week and still had frost on the inside of the door. Their floor had lifted in one corner, tearing the chinking open. Their children slept on a table because the floor felt like river ice. At Luca's cabin, the stove burned low. Elena did not wear her mittens indoors. Nico played on the floor with carved scrap blocks and did not cry when his hands touched the boards. The air was not luxurious. No one would mistake it for summer, but it was steady. The heat from the little stove stayed in the room instead of vanishing through the floor. On the 6th morning of the freeze, Luca found the first proof small enough to hold in one hand. He had left a tin of wheel grease in a shallow niche on the south side of the plinth, tucked behind a projecting stone so it would not fill with snow. He expected it to be useless, frozen stiff, like every other grease pot in the district. But when he tipped the tin, the grease sagged. Then it moved. Slowly, thickly, it poured. Luca stood in the wind and watched a dark ribbon slide from the rim. Across the road, a similar tin, hanging from a freight wagon, had turned solid enough to knock against wood. His had not. The stone had held just enough of yesterday's sun to keep a little pocket of the world from crossing the line. He did not call the neighbors. He did not boast. He only carried the tin inside and set it on the table. Elena looked at it. Then she looked at him. For the first time all winter, Luca smiled. 2 days later, the camp learned. A freight wagon from Alma was coming up the road when its rear wheel slammed into a frozen rut and split the outer felloe. The driver, Caleb Rusk himself, had a wagon loaded with flour, coffee, lamp oil, and blasting powder. He could not leave it in the road. He could not drag it without destroying the wheel. The nearest shelter was Luca's cabin. Rusk hated the fact before he accepted it. He sent a boy for Orrin Vale, the camp wheelwright, a thin man with cracked knuckles and a temper made worse by cold. Orrin arrived with his tool roll under one arm, cursing before he had even seen the brake. "No man can set a wheel in this," he said. "Not with bare fingers, not with iron this cold." They hauled the damaged wheel to the lee side of Luca's stone base. The wind still cut over the snow, but beside the wall, the air felt different. Not warm, still cold enough to sting the lungs, but quieter, drier, less hungry. Orrin knelt and began loosening the bolts. Within minutes, he stopped frowning. His hands should have been failing. They were not. He pulled off one glove to feel the split in the wood, then the other, because the work required touch. Rusk stepped forward. "Vale, put those back on. You'll lose fingers." Orrin did not answer. He was staring at his own hands. They were red. They hurt. But they still obeyed him, He worked barehanded against the stone wall, fitting the brace, tightening the iron, packing grease into the hub, testing the wheel by touch. The tools did not feel friendly. The air was brutal. But the deep ache that usually climbed into his bones was missing. At last, he put his palm flat against the plinth. The stone was not warm. That confused him more than warmth would have. It felt dry, solid, neutral, as if the wall were not giving heat so much as refusing to surrender it. Oren looked at Luca, then at the ridiculous little cabin sitting above the huge base.
"Rusk," he said quietly, "this wall is breathing."
Rusk said nothing. The man who had called it a tomb watched a wheelwright finish a repair with bare hands in weather that had frozen hinges shut all over the settlement. The story traveled faster than any explanation Luca could have given. By the next week, men were arguing about the foundation in the store. Some called it luck. Some called it foreign superstition. But the blacksmiths listened. A blacksmith understands stored heat. He knows an anvil can hold warmth after the forge dies down. He knows a thick iron plate changes temperature slowly. He knows the difference between flame and reserve. When Oren Vale described the grease, the bare hands, and the floor inside Luca's cabin, the smiths stopped laughing first. That spring, a new assay shed was planned near the mill. The first drawing showed timber sills on shallow stone pads, the usual cheap work. But the smith in charge, a German named Ansel Bauer, crossed it out. "Build it like Marri's," he said. The contractor protested the cost. Bauer tapped the drawing with a burned finger. "I do not pay men to lose heat to the ground." The shed was built on a lower, broader version of Luca's plinth, with its south wall exposed and its floor lifted clear of the soil. The following winter, its wash water did not freeze solid overnight. The scale table stayed truer. Men could work longer before their hands locked up. The idea did not become a fashion. It became a quiet standard in places where work mattered more than appearances. Years later, engineers would have names for pieces of what Luca had done. They would speak of thermal mass, passive solar gain, conductive heat loss, frost heave, and foundation isolation. They would draw diagrams. They would calculate what Luca had felt through his palm. But the principle was older than the language. Luca had not defeated winter by making a bigger fire. He had changed the path of the heat. The settlers around him believed warmth was something a man produced by burning more wood, more fuel, more effort, more smoke. If the room was cold, the answer was to make the stove angrier. Luca understood something quieter. Warmth is also something you keep, something you store, something you protect from thieves. The sun had touched every cabin in the basin. It had touched every stone, every roof, every frozen road. The energy was not absent. It was simply being wasted. His neighbors built houses that let the ground steal it. Luca built a place for it to stay. That was why the floor mattered more than the stove. That was why the ridiculous wall mattered more than the roof. And that was why a cabin that looked like a mistake became the only room in the settlement where winter could not quite get its hands around the family inside. So the next time you feel a sun-warmed stone giving back the day after the light is gone, remember Luca Marri's strange little cabin in the Colorado cold. The wall did not make heat. It remembered it. And sometimes survival begins when a person stops fighting nature long enough to notice where the invisible rivers are already flowing. If this story taught you something worth keeping, subscribe for more forgotten pieces of practical wisdom. And one final note. This video is a historically inspired reconstruction for education and storytelling. The people and specific events are fictional, while the building principles are based on real thermal behavior and traditional masonry practices. Do not attempt foundation or passive solar construction without qualified professional guidance, modern engineering, local code compliance, and appropriate safety review.